Hi everyone. We'll just wait 30 seconds as people are joining and signing in at the moment, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think people are beginning to join now. So we'll just get going, and I'm sure more people will join as we go. So hi everyone, welcome to this session on assessing and prioritising nature risks and opportunities. I'm Gemma James, I'm Head of Biodiversity and Nature at Kronos Sustainability, and this is actually our second in a series of webinars on biodiversity, where we are helping those getting started on biodiversity and nature topics by imparting our knowledge as a team with you. So if you joined our last webinar, that was a little bit of a biodiversity 101, where we got to grips with some key themes and concepts, and we also discussed how to build that business case for biodiversity. And we had a guest speaker, Katie Leach from Lloyds Bank, to talk us through that. And today we're going to look at the next step, which is to prioritise and assess your nature risks and opportunities. So we've just had COP16 Biodiversity Summit, and it might not have been as progressive as we would have hoped, but nonetheless, the momentum on biodiversity by business and finance is continuing to grow. And we've been engaging with lots of companies recently, and many of them have begun to tell us about their starting their biodiversity impact and dependencies assessment. And so this is the stage where you really start understanding where you're exposed to nature and building that evidence base of data to support that. So if we move on to the agenda slide, what we'll do today is we'll have a really quick recap on why biodiversity is important. Then I'm going to hand over to my two distinguished colleagues, Laura Fox and Rebecca Drury, who are both on the Kronos Biodiversity and Nature team. And they've been working with our clients on assessing nature risks and opportunities. And what they'll do is they'll walk you through the steps to do this, some of the tools and data sets that we've been using with clients, and they'll also share their experience of applying those steps from a bit more of a practical perspective. There is a Q&A function as well on the webinar platform for you to send through your questions to Laura and Rebecca. So please do put those into the question box as we go through the presentations today, and we'll answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, so I'm not really going to spend much time on why biodiversity is material. We went over the different types of risks, businesses, we went over the different types of risks and that business and finance are actually exposed to in our last webinar. But before I hand over to Laura and Rebecca, we just wanted to remind you of the potential financial and operational impacts that nature-related risks can have on the business, which is why it's really important to start assessing those risks and opportunities. So whilst impacts are not always obvious straight away, or they might accumulate over time, it's really about reducing those risks and preventing them before they materialise through disruption to your operations and supply chains. So it's about wanting to ensure business continuity and resilience of your business model, whilst being really good stewards to reduce impacts on nature, which we're so dependent on. And we just have a couple of examples where this has materialised in the past. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Laura, and she's going to take you through to the next stage. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. Afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Laura Fox, and as Gemma said, I'll be presenting a high-level run-through of the theory of assessing and prioritising using some of the frameworks and the tools currently in use, and Rebecca's going to bring that to life with examples from the work that we've done. So just to reiterate, if you're looking into this topic, you'll know that the frameworks and processes for company performance and accountability are evolving rapidly to support and encourage credible and impactful action to address nature loss. And as Gemma said, as outlined in our previous webinar, in parallel, regulators and investors are also increasing their expectations of companies in relation to nature. Tools and frameworks to support this include, for example, the Science-Based Targets Network, and you'll see their framework to the right of the screen. There's also the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development have developed roadmaps to nature positive for individual sectors. So all these mechanisms apply a similar overall logic to guiding business action on nature through a process to effectively assess, then commit, then transform, and to disclose. And normally you can disclose at any point through your process. You don't need to wait to the end. You can update on what you're actually doing and that you're in the middle of a process. The transform element is how we shift from doing business better to delivering a net positive future for nature. This element is not yet as well addressed, as most companies are still in the assess and commitment phase. Some of these frameworks and processes are related to biodiversity, and some talk about and disclose around are all related to nature as a whole, but they all lead to more integrated thinking. There's also similar logic for assessing and prioritising impacts and dependencies across these frameworks. In the case of the TNFD, that's the framing of this is the LEAP process, and this stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And it involves first identifying where a business or investment activities interface with nature, followed by evaluation of dependencies and impacts of identified issues in these locations. These are then assessed to determine nature-related risks and opportunities for business, informing strategic decisions for action and the organisation's disclosure. Most companies and financial institutions are at an early stage in terms of managing nature-related risk and opportunities. So this webinar therefore focuses on the first stage, as Gemma said, on the locate, evaluate and assess. And specifically on the processes and tools and data sets that enable you to complete these steps. Tools like the SBTN and TNFD LEAP process all have clear questions to guide the stages. The questions that we're looking to answer with the assess and prioritise stages are: where does my business interface with nature? What are the species and ecosystems that we interact with? What is the relative importance of those natural assets, and what condition are they in? And what are our potential impacts on nature? Even though that seems highly theoretical when you're starting out and you might seem a very long way from your supply chain, eventually you need this information because it's going to inform what targets you'll set as an organisation, how you'll measure and track that performance on nature, and ultimately what you choose to disclose. It's widely recognised that assessments of nature-related risk and opportunities can be complex and resource-intensive. So to help with this, you can undertake an initial screening exercise of the business and any new business activities that are under consideration. It's crucial to include those as a first step to identify which activities present a moderate or high dependency and impacts on biodiversity. This helps you to focus resources on more in-depth assessment in areas of the most potential impact and therefore risk. At this stage, depending on the information available, for most companies this will be a desk-based exercise. So we need to keep in mind that it is potential impacts and risks that you will be identifying, and this will help you to funnel down to those priorities of those high impacts and dependencies. You can then use this to build a business case internally to ensure buy-in from senior leaders and sufficient resources to undertake a more comprehensive assessment. In our last webinar, our guest speaker, Katie Leach from Lloyds, also shared practical tips for and her professional experience of building that biodiversity business case and getting internal buy-in. So please check out that recording if you'd like to hear more tips from Katie on building the business case in your company. The first stage of assessing is to conduct a materiality assessment to prioritise efforts. For the materiality assessment, you will select the scope, which includes the activities you want to cover, including any known high impact commodities, where in the value chain to focus the assessment, whether that's upstream, direct operations, and downstream, and then in any geographic locations that you want to target. The plan would be to increase the scope of your assessment over time. When faced with very complex supply chains, there are multiple ways you can choose to assess. You could assess through volume and financial value, the importance of an ingredient to a particular supply chain or a product, the perceived risk, which could be linked to NGO campaigns that have identified those high-risk deforestation commodities. Very few people are actually doing comprehensive assessments. So depending on the stage you're at, you could look at one or two supply chains to build understanding across the business. From our experience, we've seen selection based on strategic importance to a company, or down to even if an internal team have a specific or existing expertise. One of the questions we're asking here is, what are the material impacts and dependencies, and where in your value chain do they arise? At present, I think it's fair to say the focus of assessments are on the upstream and the direct operations, as it's at the upstream raw production stage where most companies will generally have the greatest impact on nature. As a result, understanding where these materials are coming from is key to the company being able to go on and assess risk and opportunities. The materiality assessment helps you to prioritise which ingredients or materials you need to focus on in order to invest the time and the effort to identify that geographic location. For example, you would be determining if the soy in animal feed from your cattle or salmon supply chain is coming from the US or Brazil, as these present very different risks and responses. And we will discuss the challenges around these further in the lessons learned part of the webinar that Rebecca's going to go over. Assessments and methods for downstream operations are evolving, and we can expect to see an increase in the assessments and disclosures on downstreams in the future, and there are a number of organisations looking at the methodologies around that. One resource that's designed to help guide you through the entire process, and there are multiple out there, but the one I just wanted to highlight here and to give you an example is the Nature Strategy Handbook from It's Now for Nature. And as you can see, it provides those guiding questions, recommendations of what each stage should include, and the resources to help from that. And this is the example of their guidance for the materiality to prioritise. And all the frameworks provide similar outlines and guiding questions like this. But just to highlight, It's Now for Nature is a global campaign of over 100 businesses and organisations that have rallied the call for businesses to act on nature and contribute to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. And in joining it, businesses are encouraged to submit their own strategies on their website. And you can actually look up these strategies by company, by sector, by geographic location. So you can see some examples of what others are doing as well through this campaign. So once you've identified those potential impacts and dependencies, the next step is to assess your risks and opportunities. In addition to the common logic in terms of the process, there is also a common logic to help identify risk and opportunities. In this is the pressure state response model, or the impact state response model as referred to in TNFD, here shown on the screen. Flowing from left to right, impacts refer to the pressure that a company is placing on biodiversity from production or consumption processes. For example, natural resource use, changes in land use, and emissions to air, water, and soil. Then you have state of nature or biodiversity. Both of these are used by disclosure frameworks interchangeably. And this refers to the ecosystem extent and condition. So what condition is the habitat in? Is it very degraded, or is it fairly intact? We also want to include what we know about identified species population size and extinction risk for those species. Understanding the state of nature provides a baseline to measure changes and identify any restoration needs. Then you move on to the ecosystem assets and services. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with the terminology around ecosystem services and evaluation, and this refers to the benefits and flow from biodiversity and ecosystem services, and then the economic value that these provide to the companies. So how companies are impacting on ecosystem assets and services and the dependencies they have on those. The famous ones obviously are pollination, water filtration. And you need to understand these elements to understand what the risks are to your business and what the business response could be. At this point, I really wanted to highlight that your impacts and dependencies don't directly translate into risk and opportunities. For example, you might have identified water consumption as an impact, but water consumption to produce a ton of strawberries is very different if that's in Scotland versus southern Spain. Or you might identify a significant impact on a population of a specific species of shrew in the UK, and that might not be a huge problem. But if it's a very rare shrew protected by legislation, then you have a very different risk. That's why it's so important to get down to the geographic location, as it's that local context that defines your risk and opportunities. As previously mentioned, to assess and prioritise your nature-related risk and opportunities, ideally, in a perfect world, you would need data on the following. As I've mentioned, the location of the business activities, be they direct operations or within a supply chain. Data on the state of nature and ecosystem services in the location. For a comprehensive assessment, ideally, again, we recommend the categories including ecosystem extent, ecosystem condition, species population size and extinction risk. And ideally, you would have access to data on how your business activities depend on and impact nature and ecosystem services in those locations. The types of data that may be potentially available include primary data collected in situ from primary sources such as field surveys, remote sensing, eDNA, EIAs and biodiversity action plans, whether that's been done by the company or sometimes you have them interpreted at a county level, such as in the UK, which feed into then the national biodiversity action plans. You also have secondary state data, and that's data that's been collected for broader purposes, such as geodata spatial layers, and then secondary pressure state data, which is created using modelling, so also footprinting data. Accessing this type of data can be challenging, and Rebecca will cover that in a few minutes. I also just wanted to mention that the TFD have launched a consultation in October on developing market access for nature-related data, as it's been recognised that this is a considerable challenge. And they're looking at how to turn that into a platform. And that consultation is open until the 7th of January. So if you'd like to input your data needs in that, I'm sure they'd like to hear from you. And finally, we thought it might be useful just to mention the key tools and data sets for locating and scoping, assessing the state of nature, and then for evaluating those impacts and dependencies. And they're listed here for you. This list isn't exhaustive, as there are a multitude of tools and data sets and footprinting approaches, but these are some of the ones that we refer to frequently within our own work. Over to you, Rebecca.
Wonderful, thanks Laura. So as Laura mentioned, over the last year we've supported a number of banks and also mining companies to undertake initial processes for the assessment and prioritisation of their nature-related risks and opportunities, and this has focused very much on the TNFD LEAP process that Laura took us through, and specifically on the locate, evaluate and the early stages of assess. As shown in the schematic on this slide. So in this section of the webinar, we're going to share some of the key learning that we've taken from these projects. So as Laura said, assessment of nature-related risks and opportunities can be really complex, it can be really resource intensive, and this is particularly the case if your business works with multiple commodities, multiple supply chains, or if your investment portfolio is large and varied. So as such, the first key learning really is that it's essential to prioritise within your assessment. So start with a limited scope and set yourself some really clear boundaries. So this can be done, as Laura mentioned, through a really high level materiality screening to identify the most material impacts and dependencies on nature. So this could, for example, be based on location, it could be based on commodity or process of production even. So it's completely fine to make a start by focusing on a limited, more manageable scope that is matched to the resource that you have available. You don't have to do it all at once. And then, of course, over time, you can expand the scope of the assessment in line with your capacity. And also with this initial materiality assessment, hopefully helping you to make the case internally for the need for deeper assessment, and then, of course, the resourcing to do this. So, for example, with the banks we've worked with, we first screen their portfolios to assess their greatest exposure to different sectors and geographies, then taking forward more in-depth assessment only for the highest risk sector classes that the banks were most exposed to. So for one bank, we looked at the sectors with the most investment plus those with the highest impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. For this, the earliest one, we've referred to the UNEP WCMC and Finance for Biodiversity Initiative 2022's sector assessment, which focuses on direct operations only. Since we did this, so TNFD have now also published guidance on impacts and dependencies by sector, which you can also refer to. And then to make the assessment practical in the time frame in this particular instance, we then further prioritise sector classes that had investment over a certain threshold. But to assess materiality at a more granular level and in the absence of data on actual impacts and dependencies in the locations of your business or your finance activities, you can also use SBTN's sector materiality tool and Encore's sector level assessments to review potential impacts and dependencies. So for one bank, we did this, part of which is presented here, showing the classes with the highest impacts and dependencies alongside exposure. And just to note that we looked at this for direct operations and also upstream and downstream, and also for dependencies, but only the direct operations and impacts are shown simply due to the size on this slide. But following this heat mapping, to then make the pilot assessments manageable, we took just one class within this list forward for further assessment, based on it being the class with the highest exposure. For another bank, a national development bank, whose investments focus mainly on the agricultural sector, just within one country, we defined scope by commodity, by exposure and geography. So specifically, we took a single agricultural crop. We focused on the one state where most of this crop is grown. But obviously, if you're a bank or a business with international exposure, you could prioritise this by area of biodiversity importance, for example, as well as by perhaps commodity and exposure. Within the mining companies that we worked with, the initial scope only included operational mine sites. We placed an evidence-based 50-kilometre radius around each of the sites, but we did not initially include the supply chain or transportation or distribution infrastructure. Then the second lesson is that though data gaps do exist, this should not prevent meaningful assessment. So we know that a huge challenge is a lack of data. Data on the state of biodiversity and the impacts on biodiversity is really limited. It's generally available at a more macro level. However, although the data are far from perfect, it shouldn't stop you from doing the assessment. There are global data sets available that can help you to assess biodiversity importance at a really high level. Where possible, these can then be triangulated with local data sets. So, for example, published literature, maybe there have been site visits and reports from that, EIAs or biodiversity strategies. You may be able to complete interviews or send around a questionnaire survey to collect specific information as well to allow a more detailed understanding in the relevant locations. And as we've already mentioned, when you can't get actual impact and dependency data, you can draw on sector-specific potential impacts and dependencies, including from publicly available global data sets, such as those from Encore and SBTN that I referred to in the previous slide. You can also use proxies as long as your assumptions and the limitations are clearly logged and understood. So just as an example, if you're sourcing coffee from Vietnam, most coffee in Vietnam is grown in the Central Highlands. The province that produces the most is Dak Lak, so you could just focus on Dak Lak as a proxy for the dependencies and impacts associated with the production of Robusta coffee sourced from Vietnam in your first instance. So, for example, when we worked with the banks, inevitably it was the supply chains of their clients where the impacts and dependencies were most material, and the data from suppliers wasn't readily available. So to assess biodiversity importance at these locations, we used a combination of primary data where it was available and secondary global data sets. So we drew on a range of global data sources. So some of those included, for example, the Global Forest Watch, Aqueduct Water Atlas, Encore, and also the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, IBAT. And just to note that corporate use of some of these resources, so for example, the IUCN Red List does require permission and may come at a cost. One bank that we worked with also collected their own data on biodiversity importance. So they had an amazing data set, including things like vegetation cover, protected areas, location of Indigenous people's rights. And they were also able to disaggregate this at a level of municipality. And this was a really valuable and efficient means of assessing biodiversity importance that we then triangulated with those global data sources. Likewise, in the following step, which involves evaluating the impacts of your business operations or your financed activities on environmental assets and ecosystem services in the areas of biodiversity importance. Again, we did not have access to the data of actual environmental assets and ecosystem services or the impact drivers. So again, we relied on potential impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And again, we drew on the SBTN materiality tool and Encore to identify the most relevant impacts and dependencies for the activities that we were focused on. We then used all of this data to develop impact and dependency pathways. So this is something that was developed by the Capital Coalition's Natural Capital Protocol, and the TNFD also builds on this. These pathways present the potential impacts and dependencies and then follow a logic, which I've shown on the slide here, that documents first your impact and dependency, the potential change on the state of biodiversity as a result of that dependency and impact, in turn, the potential change in ecosystem services and the potential impact on your business. So as you can see, even though there are limitations with data availability, as well as progressing assessment, this exercise can really provide a valuable overview of the biodiversity importance of the locations that you're looking at, to really inform and contextualise your assessment and inform next steps. So that takes me on to the third lesson, which is that these results can be used to address these gaps and to drive change in your organisation and beyond. So as well as identifying the most material impacts and dependencies requiring further attention, this process also identifies where more data is needed, or maybe a data management system is needed. And this can then be used to inform your planning and identify future resourcing needs to build your capacity to address nature-related risks and opportunities in your organisation. So, for example, one bank we worked with had access to a system that could overlay additional variables to assess biodiversity importance by quadrant over a map of all of the activities they were financing, which is something that the other banks we were working together to pilot this with noted as an area that they also wanted to develop. This process can also inform a phased approach to a biodiversity strategy that enables more comprehensive assessment of the risks in the future. So, for example, one of the development banks we worked with were able to build a materiality matrix that's now assisting processes such as credit analysis, and also operationalising risk mitigation in the sectors that they had prioritised, just as a starting point to integrate nature in as a risk. Related to this, another challenge we found for clients is often that the topic of biodiversity is not really a priority in discussions in their organisation. So it often isn't receiving the same attention as for other issues, and this can result in limited resources to deal with the in-depth assessment of nature, risks and opportunities that's needed. So again, undertaking this kind of high-level bounded biodiversity assessment can really help you to communicate those biodiversity risks and opportunities within your organisation, and help you to prioritise the topic. And we've also found that often that making the links with your climate work can often open doors, as commitments and funding are often already in place. And the fourth lesson is that specialist knowledge is required. So as we've discussed, an understanding of the biodiversity importance of a location, of your business activities or your finance activities is really critical to this entire process. So this will involve reviewing scientific literature, reviewing EIAs and biodiversity strategies, maybe reports from site visits, or undertaking site visits, interviewing those on the ground. And this requires prerequisite knowledge of biodiversity to really accurately interpret and analyse the data you're looking at. So having supported others through this process, often those who do not work on a daily basis with biodiversity but focus on managing risk and investment decision making in a company context, this really demonstrated that both locating and then assessing the data requires a certain level of expert knowledge and understanding. So you may need to bring this expertise in house, or you may need to make sure you've got the right external support from those with the necessary knowledge. And then the final lesson might seem obvious, but as a consultant, we have to meet client deadlines. We're often pressured to complete assessments within quite tight timeframes. And so the point here is that you should leave enough time to conduct the actual assessment. The process is often iterative. You don't necessarily know when you start how much data that is available, what the quality of the data is. So you need to allow time for this. There's a lot of data that can be involved. You may also need to engage with stakeholders to get or to validate the information that you need. So for example, with the mining companies, we were put into contact with the biodiversity and environmental staff at sites, but we found we also needed to talk to community representatives and legal teams, particularly where there were Indigenous communities present and where there were potential issues around land rights. So you really need to allow time to coordinate with these stakeholders, and you might need to engage with them more than once. So just make sure you allow enough time for the assessment and for the data collection, the analysis and stakeholder engagement required. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Gemma. We welcome any questions that you have. Thanks.
Great, thanks Rebecca, thanks Laura, and thank you for the questions that are already coming through. So if you have some more questions, then please pop them into the question function. So maybe if we just bring down the slides, what we'll do is we'll just do a straight Q&A. We'll address what's in the question box. So let's start with the first one. So actually the first one that has come through is quite tricky. So let's get this one out the way. So I think Laura, on one of the slides, you talked through, some of the key questions that we would be asking as we go through this stage. So the question we have is are changes in biodiversity attributable to our activities? So that was the question we were trying to answer. So the person has recognised this is very challenging to answer given the data landscape. And do we have any insights on how to assess this? Do you want to give it a first shot? And Rebecca, you'll feel free to jump in as well.
Jen, Rebecca, and help me out. Yeah, I mean, that's probably the hardest. That's the bit that you're trying to ascertain, really, isn't it? How much is attributable to our activities, and how much are we then also dependent on that? And really, you're only going to get to that point once you get down to location. And I realise when you're buying in across a supply chain, it's like, well, if we're only buying a tiny percent of what's coming out of this factory, how much really is attributable to us? Is that what the question was trying to answer, Gemma? Have I understood that correctly? Yeah. And I suppose it's not that you're necessarily looking to own the attribution of that impact. It's that you're trying to understand where these impacts are occurring and where there is a risk to your operation. So it could be that even if it's a very small risk, it could be a reputational risk or financial risk, it still represents a risk. And it might be, okay, it's such a small amount. Is there another factory that we could buy from that isn't having such an impact, that has better processes in place? So you could, it might be as simple as looking to shift that potential impact or risk to somewhere that reduces it, or working down the supply chain to reduce it. So I think it's probably maybe trying to move away from the mindset of, well, we're attributing a huge percent of this risk to us, and thinking, where are the risks to our supply chain? Because if that risk is occurring in that location, it's highly likely to be occurring in other sites as well. But it might look quite different according to the geographic location of where that's taking place. Does that make sense? I hope I'm
That's great. Thanks, Laura. Maybe just to illustrate with an example. So like if you think about a mining company that is operating within, say, a forest region, they've sort of created access into a forest. You've now got an increase in population in the forest who might be hunting, wildlife. You're seeing a decline in biodiversity, despite the fact that it's not the mining industry creating that decline in the mining company creating that decline in biodiversity. The perception, because of their presence within that area, actually creates a reputational risk for them, even though that could be an impact created by local community members, for example. So sometimes it's more about the risk than the direct attribution. Rebecca, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add as well that the logic pathways, so the impact and dependency pathways process you go through, if you can get that local level understanding, you're encouraged to not just think about your own impacts, but also what else is going on in that environment. So you're obviously looking at biodiversity importance, but you're also looking at what other pressures there are on the same resource. So you might be drawing water, for example. There might be 3 other factories in the area that are also drawing water. And then you would consider that in your responses. So maybe the responses would not just be that we're going to reduce our water withdrawal, but we're going to collaborate. There's that external piece as well with others in the location. It depends where you are in your how involved you are in the supply chain, but certainly the development banks were potentially looking at this level of detail. And so that would inform your response, whether you're also working with others to help reduce the overall impact. And also just, so Laura and I have worked in conservation for decades, and there's this kind of perennial challenge of attribution when you're trying to conserve a landscape or a species population when there's so many other factors going on. But what you can do is you can measure the change in the pressure that you're putting on that resource. So then, in terms of going back to Gemma's reputational risk, you've got that data and you can say, okay, well, 10 years ago we were withdrawing this much water, but now we're monitoring that and we've reduced it by half, and we've got this target to do so, and we're working with others to help them reduce their dependence on the water as well. So I don't know if that helps, but I think you can break it down into what you can control, and then you can measure that and you can communicate that as well.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Right, so the next question is, and probably one for Rebecca, can you elaborate further on the type of thresholds you've used for impacts and also some of the location indicators?
The thresholds, yeah. So we drew a lot on SPTN, the materiality screening tool, and also Encore, and they look across a range of ecosystem services for impacts and dependencies, and they give them a rating. So it goes from low, medium, high to very high. So we would take their thresholds, and likewise for the indicators that we would use to assess biodiversity importance, so that the Water Atlas, for example, will give the location a rating, so you can take that through to your assessment.
Great. And maybe I'll just add to that as well, because when we worked with the mining company, we actually developed like a calibrated system to set up the thresholds for the location indicators, at least. So we did that using that low, medium, high ranking system as well. And then where possible, we use sort of quantitative thresholds within each of those. So some of them were defined by the existing data sets that Rebecca mentioned. So maybe it's the WI aqueduct with the high, medium, low water stress. But then others, we had to decide what the appropriate threshold actually looked like. And then we had to do that in discussion with the client. So We talked about a 50-kilometre radius beforehand. So if you're thinking about proximity to protected areas or Indigenous peoples' territories, is it more than 50 kilometres, or are you in proximity which is within that 50 kilometres, or is there an overlap, or less than 1 kilometre, for example, which would be then considered high? So that just gives you an idea of how we might think about those thresholds. So then the next question, so this is probably one for Laura. It's a question on how to look at impacts in the supply chain. So the person asking the question is from a multinational food business with a complex supply chain. How do they prioritize which supply chain to even start looking at?
Yeah, I mean it's always a tricky one when you're overwhelmed with a whole multitude of supply chains. And I think we touched on that there are many ways that you could assess that. So obviously there's the high risk deforestation commodities, and I'm going to assume that if you've got high risk deforestation commodities, you've already started looking at those commodities, so you've probably got some traceability in place there. But once you've screened out those high risk commodities, you can then cut it in terms of the financial value or the volumes that you're buying, and then, as we said, overlay that with the biodiversity, my brain there, global importance areas of biodiversity. And as I said, you could even filter it down to say, okay, what commodity is potentially of area that we haven't even looked at. So we worked with a pulp and paper company, and there we ended up looking at a supply chain that they hadn't looked at before, where they'd done quite a lot of work on other supply chains, but they ended up picking this supply chain because it's one that hadn't been assessed really in that same level of detail. So it really is down to you to decide where you're going to bound your scope, particularly if you're starting, because it's going to be an initial this is going to be the assessment that you cut your teeth on to build up that understanding of materiality. So there are many ways that you can cut it once you've screened out sort of those high risk deforestation commodities and geographic location.
Great, thanks, Laura. Right, next question. So maybe this one can go to Rebecca. So you've mentioned various tools like Encore and SBTN. Can you talk through some of the limitations you found when using them?
Yeah, so I think the main limitation is that they're global data sets at a really high level. So they're looking at potential impacts and dependencies associated with that sector or subclass or production process, drawing on whatever available evidence there is available. So it's that they're based on the best available data at the time, and they're up to date, and Encore's just been updated. But they're still potential and they're very high level. So it's likely that the actual materiality of dependencies and impacts at your location will vary significantly based on its context and location. So it's just really important to remember that when you're using those global data sets, the main limitation is that they're not location specific, which is why we really encourage you, and they encourage you as well, to triangulate with location level data and look at whatever's available to triangulate that information with. So it gives you kind of a high level understanding of potential impacts and dependencies, but then they need grounding. It also is all focused on risks, not opportunities at this point. And I think, the data is a huge challenge. We have a lack of corporate disclosures, we have a lack of kind of sector specific scenarios, biodiversity impact, the location data is lacking, and it is a challenge, but also it's really rapidly changing. So with TNFD coming through, I think we'll see a lot more corporate disclosures, and we've got satellite technologies like eDNA, and artificial intelligence as well, as making it easier and cheaper to collect and analyse biodiversity data. So I think the data gaps will gradually be filled. But at the moment, I think Encore and SBTN are really helpful, but then you just need to look at triangulating with the data that you can get hold of that's more location specific, and relates to your own operations.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Right, next question. So, the last point, Rebecca, that you made on the slides was to give yourself time to do this. How much time did it actually take is the question.
Well, they all vary, the amount of time varied, but we had kind of a matter of 3 or 4 months, I think, for most of them. And we, as I said, we didn't get through the whole LEAP process, so we were evaluate and part way through assess. So there's definitely more that they could be doing, hopefully are doing now, to validate, triangulate, work with suppliers to fill some data gaps. But it's kind of, I mean, how long is a piece of string? And it's quite iterative. So I guess if you've only got 4 months, that will inform the scope and how you bound it and what you can do within that time. Or if you're approaching it with like, well, we absolutely have to do all of this supply chain, all of this commodity, that will then inform your time frame. So it's hard to give a definitive answer, but you can definitely make progress with a limited scope in 3 to 4 months.
Great, thank you. I'm just seeing if there's any more questions come through. Okay, so one's just come through. So working with your company clients, were they receptive to the findings of their priority risks and dependency assessments? And how did you apply or integrate the results into their strategies? Maybe the second question we can't answer yet, but certainly the first bit. Rebecca, do you want to talk a bit about the banks?
Yeah, so the banks that we worked with, actually, it was more of a kind of capacity building approach. So we weren't sent away to go and do it for them and then come back and present it. So I don't think that was really a challenge, because we kind of they walked hand in hand. That's really, but we worked at each step. We worked together, and they were very much involved in finding the data, sharing their own. You know, I mentioned one of them had an amazing data platform, so it was very collaborative, and we broke it down into each step. And presented back each step as we, you know, with the wider team as well, so that everyone came with us through the process. So actually, when we got to the end, I felt like everyone owned the results and was, you know, perhaps aware of the task ahead and the work that had to be done on top of that, but also felt like they could then take that forward themselves. So yeah, that wasn't really a challenge. I think it's about how you approach the work and how you work with your clients.
Yeah, and then, I mean, on the mining side, we basically we didn't finish the full assessment for them because of the time and resourcing that they had required from it, and actually an acknowledgement on their side that this was a lot more work and time intensive than they had expected. So actually they are going to take the next stage of the assessment into their own hands, if you like, because actually there was also a recognition that they needed to own it. So you can have consultants to come in, help collate the data, so provide some initial thinking and analysis. But what we found was that we were running the process, and you know, we were sort of unpicking, and it was all based on information that the company at the corporate level, but then what we were receiving at the site level. And sometimes we found there was a bit of a disjointed or it was a little bit disconnected from the information that we were getting. So actually they're taking it in-house to carry on to the next step of the assessment, so that they can actually own it and run it themselves as well. But actually, I mean, I spoke to them quite recently where they actually do need a little bit more of that biodiversity expertise in order to help them through with that thinking. So there's also I guess a question in terms of the strategy of who runs it and how much ownership does the business have in obviously getting the buy-in with the different parts of the company as well. Okay, so I think that they are all the questions. Sorry, that was a long list that was just threw at you there. If there are no other questions coming through, I'll give you 30 seconds if anyone wants to send something through really quickly. But I think that seems to be it. So I think what we'll do is, if we wrap up there, thanks so much, Rebecca and Laura, for being open to answering all of those. And thank you everyone for sending through all those great questions. If you do have any others in the meantime that you're thinking about, please send them through. We hope, I mean, this whole webinar is giving you a little bit of confidence, I guess, in getting started in your assessment. It does feel like quite a big undertaking. But as mentioned, start small and then scale up as you become more proficient in the process and you get to grips with the data that's available to you. It can be an iterative process, as Rebecca said. And obviously, Rebecca, Laura and I are here if you wish to bounce further ideas around. Our next webinar is likely to be slightly more topical. We've had a bit of demand on specific topics from clients. So obviously, if you also have particular topics you'd like us to cover in the future, then please let us know as well. So do look out for details for that. So a recording of the slides will be made available, a recording of this webinar and the slides will be made available soon. And thank you all so much for participating, and I hope you have a really great day.
Thanks very much. Bye.